My name is Vivian Hart. I'm 37 years old, and until that email arrived, I believed my relationship was going through something difficult, but temporary. Not over, not beyond repair, just strained. That was the version of the truth I had been living with. Julian Mercer and I had been together for 8 years, long enough that our life no longer looked dramatic from the outside. No big declarations, no constant affection, no visible disaster. Just routines. Groceries that appeared in the fridge without discussion. Bills paid on time. His shoes by the door. My coffee mug on the same shelf every morning. We had become the kind of couple people assume is stable because nothing looks urgent. And maybe that was the problem. Nothing looked urgent, so nothing got questioned. But looking back, the signs had been there. Small ones. The kind that only makes sense after everything breaks open. Julian had started drifting, not physically at first, but in quieter ways. Conversations with him felt delayed, like he was always arriving half a second late to the moment. He would nod without really answering, laugh a beat after everyone else. His phone started facing down again. That detail stayed with me. He used to do that years ago, when his ex-girlfriend still found excuses to reach out. Back then, I noticed. Back then, I asked. This time, I told myself not to. I told myself people get tired. People pull inward. People go through seasons they don't know how to explain. I repeated that often enough that it started to feel like wisdom instead of avoidance. Then the email came. Not at night. Not after a fight. Not even after one of those tense, unfinished conversations couples have when something is clearly wrong. It arrived in the middle of an ordinary workday, between a meeting I barely remember and a spreadsheet I had been updating for nearly an hour. The subject line was neutral. That was the first thing that felt off. No urgency. No emotion. Nothing that warned me my life was about to split into before and after. So I clicked it without thinking. And then I read it. Julian wrote that he was ending the relationship and needed space. He asked me to respect his privacy. That was all. No explanation. No apology. No acknowledgement that 8 years had just been reduced to language that sounded colder than any real goodbye should. I read it again, slower that time. Not because I didn't understand it, because I needed to confirm it was really as cold as it felt. It was. The office around me kept moving. Someone laughed across the room. A printer started up near the hall. A chair rolled over the floor with that hollow sound office chairs always make. Everything continued exactly as it had 5 minutes earlier, except my life had changed in a way no one else could see. And the word that stayed with me wasn't relationship. It was privacy. That word went deeper than the breakup itself, because privacy, in that moment, didn't feel like respect. It felt like exclusion. Like he was telling me that whatever had already been decided, whatever had already been unfolding, I was now outside of it. And that was when I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit before. Julian hadn't just decided to leave. He had already left. Emotionally. Quietly. Completely. Long before he informed me. That realization didn't feel loud. It felt still. Like the air around me had shifted and only I could tell. People think betrayal is noisy. They imagine yelling, tears, slammed doors, some visible moment where everything breaks. But sometimes it arrives quietly, clean, controlled, final. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a second. Not long enough for anyone to notice, just long enough to let the truth settle. We hadn't been perfect, I knew that. There had been distance, weeks where we talked more about schedules than feelings, nights when he came home distracted, mornings when I left before he woke up. But none of that had felt final. It felt temporary. Fixable. Something we would eventually sit down and talk through. Now I could see how wrong I was. Because when someone is planning to leave, they usually don't prepare you. They prepare themselves. The leaving doesn't begin when they tell you. It begins earlier. In silence. In withdrawal. In private decisions you're no longer included in. By the time you hear about it, part of it is already over. I didn't cry. Not then. Because clarity can cut through emotion in a way shock sometimes can't. And in that moment, I understood one thing very clearly. If I reacted, I would be stepping into a version of events he had already shaped for himself. I would be the one catching up, asking questions he had already answered alone. I refused to do that, so I replied with one sentence. Of course. No questions. No accusations. No attempt to drag him back into a conversation he had clearly left before I knew it was happening. Just agreement. Brief, controlled, final. I watched the message send. It looked small on the screen, almost too small for what it meant. But it mattered. Because what Julian didn't understand was this. Distance doesn't belong to one person once it's created. If he wanted that line, then it became real for both of us. I closed the email and looked at the time. 3:14 p.m. The day kept moving. So did I. I reached for my notebook and turned to a blank page. At the top, I wrote his name, Julian Mercer. Under it, I wrote, he already decided. I needed to see that sentence in my own handwriting, because it stopped me from lying to myself, stopped me from pretending this had been sudden, stopped me from believing the right words could still reverse it. No, this had been considered, prepared, delivered. And somewhere underneath the shock, something else began to form. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than that. Something sharper. Alignment. If this was no longer a conversation, then I would stop treating it like one. If he had already changed the reality, then I would deal with the reality that was actually in front of me, not the version I had hoped was still salvageable. I opened my inbox again, not to reread his message as a wound, but to look at it as a record, something clear, something dated, something that showed exactly what he had done. And for the first time since I read it, I felt something steadier than disbelief. I felt the first edge of control returning. The second message is where most people lose themselves. The first response is instinct. The second is emotion trying to renegotiate what has already happened. I knew better than to send one. So instead of typing again, I started organizing. I forwarded his email, not to family, not to friends, to a professional contact who handled breakups involving shared housing, accounts, and practical separation. A neutral third party. Someone who dealt in logistics, not sympathy. I didn't add commentary. I didn't explain. I just forwarded it exactly as it was. Because the moment you start over-explaining, you start sounding like you're trying to prove something. And I wasn't going to prove pain I hadn't invented. Then I opened another tab. Our shared accounts. There weren't many, but there were enough. A joint credit line, a couple of subscriptions, a utilities account tied to both our names. Small things. But small things matter when a life starts splitting in two. I hovered over his name for a moment. Not because I was hesitating, because I was measuring. There's a difference. Hesitation asks whether you should act. Measuring asks what changes when you do. I clicked. Adjusted limits where I needed to. Removed permissions where it made sense. Left alone what still needed to stay in place for the moment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing reckless. Just practical corrections that matched the reality he had already introduced. Then I opened my company portal. Emergency contact. That one felt heavier. Because it wasn't about money. It was personal. Julian's name sat there like it had always belonged. For a long time it had. I stared at it once. Then I deleted it. Replaced it. Saved. No ceremony. Just accuracy. The office kept moving around me. No one knew. No one needed to. That was the strange part. Life doesn't announce your breaking point to the room. It lets you sit inside it quietly while everything around you continues like nothing has happened. But something had happened. Completely. And I was adjusting faster than I expected. Not in a proud way. In a revealing way. Like discovering there was a version of me that had been waiting for the moment when confusion stopped being useful. I checked my inbox again. Nothing from Julian. No follow-up. No clarification. No, we should talk. Just silence. And that silence told me almost as much as the email had. He expected distance. He expected compliance. Maybe he expected me to stay in the role of the one being left. But the more I looked at what he had done, the clearer it became that this wasn't only about leaving. It was also about control. Control over timing. Control over information. Control over how the story would be framed. And especially control over how I would behave inside it. 2 days passed like that. No message. No call. No sign that he expected anything beyond what he had already set in motion. And I didn't reach out. Not once. I didn't check his location. Didn't reread old messages looking for hidden clues. Because I already had the only clue that mattered. He already decided. Everything else would only turn into noise. But underneath that quiet, something didn't sit right. His email had been too clean. Too controlled. Too prepared. And yet there had been no real follow-through. No practical conversation. No discussion about logistics. No clear next steps. That didn't match. People who want clean endings usually follow them with clear actions. He hadn't, which meant one of two things. Either he expected me to handle the mess for him, or there was something else happening behind the scenes that mattered more to him than clarity did. I didn't act on that thought yet. I just kept it, stored it where it belonged. Because reacting too early to incomplete information is how people hand control back. And I wasn't going to do that. Late on the second afternoon, I stood up from my desk and walked to the window at the end of the floor. The city looked exactly the same. Traffic moving, people crossing. Nothing paused to acknowledge what had shifted inside my life. For the first time since the email, I didn't find that cruel. I found it useful, because it reminded me of something simple. The world doesn't stop and wait for you to understand what happened. You either move while the picture is still incomplete, or you get left behind by it. I went back to my desk and opened my inbox one more time. Still nothing from him. Just the forwarded email sitting in my sent folder. Time-stamped. Precise. Undeniable. A record. And records have weight. Sometimes more than feelings. Sometimes more than intentions. Sometimes more than the story someone hopes to tell after the fact. I looked at it for a few seconds, then closed the tab. Because I had a feeling. A quiet one. But clear. Whatever Julian thought he still controlled was about to be tested. The call came just before noon on the third day. Not from Julian. From HR. I almost let it go to voicemail. The number looked routine. The kind of internal call that usually meant a policy question or some small scheduling issue. But something in me paused. Not fear. Recognition. I answered. Vivian, hi. Do you have a moment? The voice was calm, professional, carefully neutral. I do, I said. There was a short silence on the other end, the kind people use when they are choosing words they don't want to sound too direct. We wanted to check in regarding a situation that was brought to our attention. That phrasing mattered. Not reported. Not filed. Just brought to our attention. Soft enough to sound harmless. Structured enough to mean it wasn't. My fingers stilled on the edge of the desk. I'm listening. Another pause. Then, someone contacted us and expressed concern about your current state after a personal situation. We just wanted to make sure everything is okay on your end. There it was. Concern. Current state. Personal situation. All the right words, arranged carefully enough to imply instability without saying it outright. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rush to correct them. When people reveal the version they've been given, the smartest thing you can do is let them finish. Only then do you know what you're actually answering. I appreciate that, I said evenly. Can I ask what was specifically communicated? A slight shift. They hadn't expected that question. Well, it was suggested that things might be emotionally difficult right now, and we wanted to be proactive. Suggested. Of course. Nothing direct. Nothing someone would want traced back word for word. Just enough to plant doubt. I turned slightly in my chair, angling away from my screen. Would context help? I asked. Yes, they said almost immediately. That would be helpful. Good, because context was the one thing I had in full, along with a record. I opened my inbox and pulled up Julian's email. I didn't need to reread it. I knew every line already. My boyfriend sent me an email 2 days ago, I said. He told me he was ending the relationship, asked for space, and asked me to respect his privacy. Silence. Not disbelief. Not resistance. Just recalculation. I replied once, I continued. Briefly, I have not contacted him since. Another pause. Longer this time. And has there been any direct conflict since then? They asked. No. I let that sit, because the absence mattered as much as anything else. I've updated a few practical things on my side to reflect the change, I added. Shared accounts, emergency contact information, things like that. Quietly, without conflict. That wording was deliberate. If there was any escalation in this situation, it had not started with me. Would you be able to forward that email to us? They asked. There it was. The point where implication meets document. Yes, I said. No hesitation. I forwarded it exactly as it was. No explanation, no extra note, just the original message. Unchanged. Timestamp. Language. Intent. Clear. We stayed on the call for a few more seconds without speaking. It wasn't awkward. It was processing. I could almost feel it happening on the other end. The reading, the comparison, the quiet realization that what had been suggested did not line up with what had actually happened. Finally, they said, "Thank you, Vivian. That is very clear." Clear. That word mattered. Because clarity doesn't chase people. It doesn't perform. It doesn't defend itself. It simply stays where it is and lets everything else be measured against it. Of course, I said. They asked a few more routine questions after that. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that changed the direction of what had already begun. Then the call ended. I set my phone down and stayed still for a moment. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because I understood exactly what had shifted. Julian had not just left quietly. He had tried to move first in another way, too. He had tried to frame the situation before I even knew there was a version of it being told anywhere else. Not publicly. Not loudly. But enough. Enough to position himself as reasonable and me as potentially unstable. He used suggestion. I used record. Those two things do not carry the same weight. I opened my email again and looked at the forwarded thread sitting in my sent folder. Delivered. Read. Irreversible. Somewhere, at that exact moment, the story he had started was being checked against something he could not soften, rephrase, or take back. And for the first time since his email, I didn't feel like I was catching up. I felt slightly ahead. Not by much, but enough to matter. That night, the messages started. Not right away. There was a gap first, a stretch of hours where everything still looked normal on the surface. Meetings, emails, the late fade of daylight against the office windows. But underneath it, something had already cracked. By the time I got home, my phone was still silent. No missed calls, no texts, nothing from Julian. That silence confirmed it. He didn't know yet, which meant when he did find out, it would not be controlled. It would be reaction. I changed clothes, moved through the apartment quietly, and noticed details I had stopped seeing days ago. His jacket still hanging near the door, his shoes still angled, as if he had stepped out for an hour and expected to walk back into the exact same life. That detail almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, because it was revealing. People who plan their exits often leave traces behind, not because they forget them, but because they assume they will still have access. I didn't touch anything. Not yet. This wasn't about erasing him. It was about letting reality reach him in its own time. My phone lit up at 8:17. His name, one message. Julian, why did HR just contact me? I looked at it without opening the thread. Then I opened it. Read it. Closed it again. No reply. The second message came almost immediately. Julian, what did you say to them? There it was. Not concern. Not confusion. Control slipping. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water. Slow. Unhurried. By the time I picked it up again, there were 3 more messages waiting. Julian, Vivian. Julian, this isn't okay. Julian, you had no right to involve them. I read them in order and noticed the progression. Question. Accusation. Authority. I typed one sentence. Stopped. Deleted it. Then typed something simpler. Me. You contacted them first. Sent. No extra explanation, no emotional edge, just fact. The typing bubble appeared almost instantly, disappeared, then came back again. I could practically see him pacing, rewriting, trying to regain his footing inside a conversation that was no longer his to manage. Finally, Julian, that's not what this is about. Of course it was, at least partly, because this had never been only about leaving. It was about controlling the conditions of the leaving, the timing, the perception, the version of me that would exist in other people's minds once he was gone. I didn't answer immediately. Then another message appeared. Julian, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. I leaned against the counter and stared at that line. There it was again. Minimization. The attempt to shrink a reality back down to the size that suited him. I typed, me. You asked for privacy. I respected it. Sent. That was all. His request. My compliance. His contradiction. Everything sat inside those 7 words. For a moment, there was nothing. No typing bubble. No response. Just stillness. The kind that happens when someone realizes the ground under them is no longer where they thought it was. Then he called. I let it ring. Watched his name fill the screen. Didn't answer. It stopped. Then started again. I declined the second call. Not dramatically. Just consistently. Because if I picked up, the conversation would shift into a form he could shape in real time. Voice creates room for interruption, revision, emotional pressure. Text records. The messages resumed. Faster now. Less controlled. Julian, we need to talk. Julian, this isn't how this should be handled. Julian, you're overreacting. That one almost made me smile. Because nothing I had done could honestly be called a reaction. If anything, I had removed reaction from the situation as completely as possible. I sent one final message. Me. There's nothing to discuss. Then I put my phone down, turned off notifications, and walked away from it. Not angrily. Not theatrically. Just done. Because I understood something clearly now. Julian was not reaching out because he missed me. He was not reaching out because he regretted the email. He was reaching out because something had interrupted the version of events he thought he controlled. And people like that rarely panic over loss first. They panic over exposure. Later that night, I stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. The same buildings, the same traffic, the same low hum of everything continuing. But something inside the situation had changed shape. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough. Enough that whatever Julian had been building in private was starting to come apart the second it touched daylight. The next morning, the apartment felt stripped down in a new way. Not emptier, clearer. I woke before my alarm and lay still for a moment, listening. No shower running, no cupboard doors, no movement from the other room. Just silence, real silence. I got up and walked through the apartment slowly. His jacket was still there. His shoes were still by the door. A mug he had used 2 days earlier still sat in the sink. It was strange how a person could remove himself from a life emotionally and still leave so much physical proof behind. I made coffee and sat at the table with my laptop. Not to check messages. To continue. That was what this had become now, a process. I reviewed everything again: accounts, subscriptions, access points, anything that connected our lives in ways that could later become messy or be used to blur what had happened. Clarity is not just truth, it is the removal of gray areas. And there had been more of those than I realized. I logged into one of the shared platforms and scrolled through recent activity. I was not looking for a particular revelation. I was looking at timing, patterns, dates. Then I saw something, not dramatic, not explicit, just consistent enough to matter. A name. His ex-girlfriend. It appeared in small ways. An old thread reopened, recent activity where there had been none for a long time. A quiet line of reconnection that should not have surprised me as much as it did. I sat back and stared at the screen. Not shocked. Not even hurt in the way I might have been a week earlier. Just aligned. Because suddenly the shape of everything made more sense. The distance, the careful email, the request for space, the need for privacy. It had not come out of nowhere. There had been something else running parallel to my life with him, quietly enough that I kept explaining it away while it was happening. I didn't dig further, didn't take screenshots, didn't prepare a confrontation. I didn't need to. Whatever was happening there was not the center of the story. It was the explanation for the timing of it. And that was enough. My phone buzzed. A message from a mutual acquaintance. Short, careful, neutral. Hey, just checking in. Heard things might be a little messy right now. Heard. That word mattered too, because it confirmed what I already suspected. Julian had not only tried to shape the story at work, he had started shaping it socially as well, softly, strategically, by implication. I looked at the message for a moment, then replied, "Everything is handled. Nothing more." Because once you start over-explaining yourself to people who only know part of a story, you end up strengthening the confusion instead of correcting it. I closed the laptop, finished my coffee, and stood. At the door, I looked again at his shoes, still waiting where he had left them, still positioned like he expected to walk back in. This time, I picked them up and carried them to the closet. Not thrown out, not lined up for drama, just moved out of sight, repositioned. That was what this whole thing really was. Repositioning of facts, of roles, of control. Julian thought he had stepped out of the relationship cleanly, thought he had defined the distance, thought he had moved first. But he had not accounted for one simple thing: consistency. Because once actions, records, and timing begin to line up, whatever story someone tries to build around them stops holding its shape. And I could feel that now. Whatever control he thought he still had was already thinning. He just had not fully realized it yet. But he would, soon. Over the next few weeks, things became quieter on the surface. Not softer, not kinder, just quieter. That was its own kind of clarity. The practical separation of our lives moved forward, the way most endings do once emotion stops being useful, through details, account closures, password changes, small administrative steps that look harmless from the outside but carry the full weight of a shared life ending piece by piece. There was no dramatic confrontation over furniture, no final argument in a doorway, no scene where one of us finally said everything we had been holding in for years. That only happens when both people are still trying to reach each other. We weren't. Julian did reach out a few more times in the beginning. A couple of messages, one missed call days later. Then one last short attempt that wasn't really about us at all. It was about tone, about how things were being handled, about what was necessary. Even then, he was still trying to narrow the shape of the fallout into something he could live with. I didn't answer. Not to punish him, not to create some performance of silence. I didn't answer because there was nothing left to clarify. Everything important had already been said, or, more accurately, documented. That was the difference. Conversations can be bent. Records cannot. And once I understood that fully, the rest became simpler. Not easy, but simple. His things left the apartment gradually. A few collected through arrangement. A few transferred through practical coordination. No scenes, no negotiations that stretched into midnight. Just the slow removal of what no longer belonged in the same space. The apartment changed because of that. Not because I redecorated, because absence has its own design. The hallway looked wider without his shoes by the door. The kitchen felt sharper once the last of his routines stopped echoing through it. Even silence sounded different after a while. Not heavy, not waiting, just settled. That may have been the strangest part. I had expected grief to arrive louder than it did. I had expected anger to flare back up, expected some delayed collapse. A night where I reread everything. A moment where I doubted myself enough to reopen the door he had closed. But that never really happened. What came instead was understanding. Slow, uncomfortable, useful. At work, everything returned to normal, or as close to normal as these things ever do. No one asked me direct questions. No one approached me with awkward sympathy. Whatever concern had been quietly raised had also been quietly resolved. That mattered, because reputation is not protected by emotional defense. It is protected by consistency, by the clean line between what happened and what can be shown to have happened. Julian, I think, understood that too late. Not all at once, but gradually. You could hear it in the way his messages changed before they stopped altogether. Less confidence, less accusation, less certainty that he still had the right to define the situation after stepping out of it. Then the messages stopped completely. Not faded. Stopped. And that told me more than another long conversation ever could have. Because when someone realizes the story they tried to shape no longer belongs to them, they often retreat from it, not because they've made peace with what happened, because they can't manage it anymore. They step back and hope silence will do what control no longer can. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. In this case, silence didn't erase anything. It clarified it. One afternoon, weeks later, I opened his original email again. Not because I needed to suffer through it one more time, because I wanted to look at it without shock, without confusion, without giving it more emotional authority than it deserved. So I read it slowly, and for the first time, it didn't feel like an ambush. It felt like evidence of exactly who he had been in that moment. A man trying to manage an ending through distance, through wording, through a kind of cold control he thought would protect him from consequences. For a brief moment, maybe it did. But only for a brief moment. Because control that depends on isolation is fragile. It works best in the dark. It works best when only one person knows the full sequence. It works best when suggestion gets to circulate before documentation catches up. But once something real enters the frame, a timestamp, a message, a sequence of actions that align, it starts to fail. Not dramatically, not all at once, just steadily, the way weak structures do. I didn't delete the email. I didn't archive it either. I simply closed it and left it where it was, not as something precious, not as a wound, just as a record of a fact that no longer needed my feelings attached to it in order to remain true. By then, I understood something I hadn't fully understood at the beginning. There is a difference between privacy and concealment. I used to think privacy was always respectful. Space, time, distance, a way of letting people move through pain without making a spectacle of it. Sometimes it is. But concealment is something else. Concealment is what people ask for when they want room to shape perception before reality catches up. Privacy protects dignity. Concealment protects narrative. Julian had asked for one, but what he really needed was the other. And that was why the whole thing collapsed the moment it touched anything solid. 6 weeks after the email, the apartment was almost entirely mine again. Mine in the practical sense. Mine in the emotional sense. Mine in the quieter sense, too. The one that matters more than people think. I stood by the window one evening with a mug of coffee in my hand and looked out at the city. The same traffic, the same buildings, the same low, indifferent movement of life continuing no matter what private thing has ended inside it. At the beginning, that indifference had felt cruel. Now it felt honest. The world had not stopped for me. And because it had not, I had been forced to keep moving until the truth became visible in full. That may have been the only gift in any of it. Not closure, not justice, just clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, changes more than emotion ever can. I was not standing there because I had won something. I was standing there because I had finally seen the shape of what happened without trying to soften it. Julian did not just leave. He tried to control the conditions of the leaving. He tried to shape how it would be perceived, who would look unstable, who would be believed first, who would spend the aftermath explaining. And when that failed, he panicked, then minimized, then pushed for conversation, then disappeared. The pattern was simple once I stopped looking at it as heartbreak and started looking at it as behavior. That was the final shift. Not from sadness to anger, from confusion to recognition. I turned away from the window and set the mug down on the counter. The apartment was quiet, not empty, finished. There is a version of me from that first afternoon at 3:14 p.m. who still thought the worst part of that email was that it ended something. She was wrong. The worst part was what it revealed, that I had already been removed from the truth long before I was informed of it. But the most important part of the story was not that he did that. It was that once the facts were visible, he could not hold that version together. Control is not about who moves first. It is about who remains consistent when everything is exposed. And truth, real truth, does not need performance. It does not need force. It only needs to exist long enough to be seen. I shut off the kitchen light, walked back through the apartment, and did not look back.